Hi there, I'm Irk and this is my channel, Get Irk. Canopy Growth Corporation has brought the harshest buzz to my portfolio. Should I hope this pot stock will bud or should I weed it out entirely? In this episode, we're going to revisit Canopy Growth Corporation with the ticker symbol CGC. Since 2022 has ended, I thought it would be a good idea to review one of my biggest stinkers. This position in particular is one that I screwed up on, but it's also now responsible for me introducing a new rule into my investing discipline. If you're interested in investing in the legalization of recreational cannabis, Canopy Growth Corporation is one of the leaders in the space. However, you need to know this space is so volatile that it's quite possible many of them, including Canopy, will go bankrupt before it is legalized by the US government. Many cannabis investors were hoping that the SAFE Banking Bill would pass during the lame duck Congress. This bill would have allowed recreational cannabis providers to get bank accounts and use credit cards. However, all hopes were dashed when the walking cartoon character that is Mitch McConnell struck down the bill entirely. So where do we stand when it comes to cannabis into the future? Personally, I believe that the legalization of cannabis is almost a certainty. The big question isn't if, it's when. And when it comes to when, it's hard to know. So if you go into this space, know that it could be really painful for quite a long time. Additionally, like I mentioned, any of these individual companies could go bankrupt. So I also choose to play the space using two ETFs, CMBS and MSOS. And you can learn more about them here in my video about them. However, even though those are exchange-traded funds and they do make up a basket of a bunch of different stocks, it still doesn't mean that the entire fund can't go bankrupt. That is a possibility. So in this video, we're going to revisit Canopy Growth Corporation. I'll show you the price action that's happened since the last video update. I'll go over a buying plan of what I would do if I wanted to open a position and didn't already currently hold shares. And then we'll go over my own disastrous position. I'll show you what I did wrong and what I've implemented in my own investing to prevent it from the future. My last video update was on September 12th of 2021. And at the time, Canopy Growth Corporation was trading around $15.05. Given that it had a high up near the 60s, this was quite a pullback already. However, it was far from done. Just like the rest of the market, particularly the speculative sectors, Canopy Growth got hit really hard throughout 2022. And since there was no legislation helping recreational cannabis get legalized, it got hit even harder. Canopy Growth ended up breaking through its previous low, which was set during March of 2020 at $9 even. And then it crashed down even further than anyone anticipated before bottoming at $2.13 in July. As I like to say, I never trust a bottom. The only thing I can tell you as a promise is that Canopy Growth will stop going down if it hits zero. And that is a possibility, not a joke. So you can see at the recording of this video at the end of December of 2022, we are reapproaching that bottom at $2.13. And there's no promises it's going to hold, but since we are much closer to the bottom than we are to its all-time high, I would consider starting a position, maybe even as soon as this bottom of this day here at $2.19. It's important to remember, because of this volatile sector and the nature of recreational cannabis, that you limit your allocation to an amount of money that you're willing to risk and lose in its entirety. And while that rule is true for any investment, trade, or speculative investment, it's particularly true when you're talking about a low price stock like this. There are no promises that Canopy Growth will survive long enough to see the legalization of cannabis. Since $2.19 is so close to the bottom at $2.13, what I would do to come up with a second buy is to draw a Fibonacci retracement. So what I would do is to use the low of this day and draw to the high of this day to create levels of support. Now that's not super useful, except when you pull out on the chart, you can see that it creates even more levels below where it might find additional support. So given how low Canopy Growth is, what I would do with my allocation is I would actually make a 25% buy at $2.19. I would take a fourth of the money I want to put to work in total and buy it at $2.19. After that, you can see that we do have a retracement line here at the 127.2% retracement at $1.54. But if you wanted to be more aggressive, one of the things that I would do is to split the difference between $2.23 and $1.54. This would give us a buying target of $1.88, and after that I would use $1.54 as my next target. However, instead of using 25% buys, I'd only use 10% buys. So at this point, we'd only have a 45% allocation in Canopy Growth. Once again, when you look at the difference between our retracement at $1.54 and our next retracement at 66 cents, that's a pretty pretty big gap. So I would do the same thing I did before and split it in half. This would give us our next buying target at $1.10. Now, I know I've said in previous videos that I wouldn't buy below $1 because most stocks that drop below $1 never recover from that point. So what you'd want to do with Canopy Growth is entirely up to you. You could either use a bigger buy, since we only have 45% of our allocation already in the stock. You'd have 55% cash that you could put to work all at once at $1.10 if you didn't want to buy below $1. Because of Canopy Growth's speculative nature, I would actually use a bigger allocation amount here, and I would buy a 25% allocation at $1.10, and then I'd put the remaining 30% to work here at 66 cents. And that would give me a full allocation in the stock. However, if you wanted to be more conservative, you could do another 10% buy at $1.10, another one at 66 cents, and that would only give you a 65% allocation. So you could make your decision whether you wanted to put in more buys below 66 cents or just say you have a 65% allocation and let it ride from there. Hey there, sorry for interrupting the video, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the possibility of Canopy Growth Corporation declaring bankruptcy. I had a Twitter user ask, hey, if Canopy Growth gets low, won't Constellation Brands with the ticker symbol STZ just buy the company outright? For those of you who don't know, Constellation, which makes wine and alcohol in the United States, owns a pretty large share of Canopy Growth. And while it is true that they would buy Canopy Growth outright if it did go down to zero, it is possible that Canopy Growth could declare bankruptcy. And here's the thing. There's a difference between declaring bankruptcy and going out of business. When a company declares bankruptcy, it gets restructured, and then another company can buy all of its assets for pennies on the dollar. As part of that restructuring, the equity, the shares or stock in the company, gets zeroed out entirely. What that means is me and anybody else who owns shares in Canopy Growth could lose all the value of those shares, and Canopy Growth could still go on to run an operating business into the future. A lot of my viewers might be too young or just didn't pay attention during the Great Financial Crisis, but a major company, General Motors, with the ticker symbol GM, declared bankruptcy in June 2009 because a lot of the financials that they did during that time made them go bankrupt. Of course, you know that General Motors is currently trading under the same ticker symbol, GM, but any of the shareholders that went through that bankruptcy were zeroed out. That means anyone who owned shares in GM before June 2009 lost all of their value after it came public again. Now, while those shareholders could go out and buy shares again, they didn't receive a discount or any shares. They were zeroed out. And the same thing could happen with Canopy Growth. While it's unusual for a company to declare bankruptcy, you must always plan for that as any long-term investor. It is always a possibility. And with that, back to our regularly scheduled video. So from here, let's take a look at my own investment in Canopy Growth Corporation and where it's come from since my last video update. My last video was on September 12th of 2021. And the last move I had made was to add to my position on September 8th at $16.40. This left me with a $4.70 per share cost, which had raised my per share cost by 65 cents. Going into 2022, I broke one of my rules. I honestly believed that Canopy Growth would not break its bottom that it set in March of 2020. So rather than stick with the profit that I had in this position, I just kept adding to it. And every time I buy above my cost basis, I'm raising my cost basis. I've been in Canopy Growth Corporation since it first came public in the United States in May of 2018, and I've ridden it up to $50 plus twice. The second time, I'd actually taken all of my original capital and profits out of this position. But this is where I broke one of my disciplines. Conviction should never trump discipline. Your rules should always beat out what you're about to do with a stock, no matter how much you have faith in a stock. And for me, I thought Canopy Growth would hold that $9, so I just kept buying up my cost basis. And I did it throughout 2022. And to make matters worse, I wasn't making small buys. I was putting in pretty decent-sized allocations every time I did make a buy, so it raised my per share cost up significantly. You can see that throughout the remainder of 2021, I made several buys at $13.70, $12.90, twice at $11.34, and then my last buy of 2021 at $9.69. The total of these buys raised my per share cost up to $7 a share, which was an increase of $2.30 since my last video update. And I thought I was doing well because $7 a share is still significantly lower than what I thought the bottom was at $9. And then we went into 2022. Throughout 2022, I started getting nervous. So instead of buying up my cost basis, I actually put an end to it. Finally. And that turned out to be the right move, since Canopy did end up breaking that $9 mark and going much, much lower. And I did continue to make buys. And again, I was buying a little bit more quantity. I had that much conviction in the space. I made my first buy on March 14th of 2022 at $5.80. I made another buy on April 22nd at $5.64. Another buy at $4.40 on June 3rd. And then my final buy before the bottom at $2.90 on June 30th. Cumulatively, these buys lowered my per share cost $1.38, which works out to a 19.71% reduction from where it was at $7. However, that means even though my last buy was at $2.90, my per share cost is at $5.62. So when it hit its bottom at $2.13, I was down more than 50%. So at this point, it was time to let Canopy run a little longer to see where it might go and whether or not that bottom was going to hold. I made a buy at $2.74, which lowered my per share cost 22 cents, which works out to a 3.5% drop down to $5.40. And from here, that leaves me with my current status. I currently have a $5.40 per share cost, which is an increase of 14.89% from where I ended the last video update. My next buy target is going to be slightly above its low at $2.20, with my next sell target not being until $6.90, a point of resistance. So what have I learned from this disaster, this Canopy Growth fiasco? Well, I've added a new rule to my discipline, and that is I'm never going to turn a winner into a loser. In other words, once I get an investment to a point where I've removed all of the capital and some of the profits out of the position, I will never add any capital back in. Sure, I may add profits into the position if it sells off, but I will never add capital in, no matter how much conviction I have that this investment's going to succeed. At this point in Canopy Growth, I am protected to the downside in the terms of I have decided exactly how much money I'm willing to lose in this position, and I will ride it to zero if it has to get that far. I do believe that the federal government will legalize cannabis on a nationwide level. And the question now just comes in whether or not Canopy Growth will last that long. If you liked this video, please hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.